All right, this is part two of our video on elements of fiction. We're picking up here with third-person narrators. So these narrators are not actually participating in the story, but they are kind of reporting the action. I'm going to start with the one in the middle, which is called the selective omniscient narrator, because this one is the one that's most common. So for the selective omniscient narrator, what this means is that the narrator knows the thoughts and feelings of really just one character, the main character. They can't know what anybody else is thinking or feeling inside their minds. They just know what the main character is thinking and feeling. If you've ever read Harry Potter, Harry Potter is told in the selective omniscient perspective. So we always know what Harry is thinking and feeling. We can kind of see inside of his head, but we don't know what Ron and Hermione are thinking. The only way that we get to know what Ron and Hermione are thinking is if they say it out loud to Harry, or if they maybe do something like fidget so Harry figures out that they're nervous, but we can't hear their thoughts. These other two are really unusual, but I'm going to tell you about them anyway in case you want to maybe experiment with them. The fully omniscient narrator knows what every single character is thinking and feeling at all times. The main time that you see this used is sort of in fairy tales or fables. So in a fairy tale, you know what Snow White is thinking, but you also know what the Wicked Queen is thinking, and you know what the seven dwarves are thinking, right? So we're not limited to just one character, but this is really only done in kind of like thick, like fantasy stories, children's stories, but it's not really used very often in more adult short stories. And then on the other end of the spectrum is the objective point of view, which is also very unusual. And the objective point of view means that you can't hear what any characters are thinking or feeling. So really all the writer is going to do here is just report what's happening. They're going to tell you who's doing what action, who's saying what out loud, but you don't get to know the private thoughts and feelings of any character. The most famous example of this is a short story called The Lottery by Shirley Jackson, which you're welcome to check out. And it's really a good use of the objective narrator. But again, if you're going to do a third-person narrator, I highly recommend the selective omniscient, especially to get started, because it's the most common and it's probably the easiest to master of these three. So the last thing I want to mention here is just to make sure that you stay consistent in point of view. So I see a lot of students who write stories in the selective omniscient, like let's say they have a story about John and Jane falling in love. And they start the story out from John's perspective. So they say, you know, John woke up and went to school and he saw Jane across the room and he thought she was so beautiful. And then they suddenly jump into Jane's perspective. And so suddenly they're saying, and Jane was sitting there looking at John and thinking that John was really cute, right? We really don't want to do that. So you really want to choose whose story is this that you're telling. Who is your main character who you're going to follow through this story? And you have to stay inside their head. If you want me to know what Jane is thinking, then you have to have John maybe observing Jane, or maybe John gets a note from Jane, but we can't just jump into Jane's thoughts. We have to stay consistent. Okay? Next on our list, we have conflict. Every story needs to have a conflict, and you can define conflict as simply what is standing between the character and the thing that she wants. What is preventing her from having what she wants? If you don't have a conflict, then your story is really just a description of happy, perfect people. So, and that's not very exciting to read. So we really want to have something standing in the way of our character achieving their goals. So we can break conflicts down into 4 types. The first type is called character versus character. In this case, there is another person between our hero and the thing that he wants. So I gave you the example here of Batman and Joker, but really any story where one character has to battle, overcome, outsmart another character to achieve their goal is going to fall into this category. The next category is character versus self. So in this category, the character has to overcome some kind of personality trait of their own to achieve happiness. I gave you the example here of the Grinch, who of course hates Christmas and really all other people. So he's a very kind of bitter, angry character, and he has to overcome that bitterness and anger to ultimately achieve happiness and harmony, which he does. This is a silly example, but you can have very serious examples. So if you have a character who has a phobia or you have a character who has like real emotional baggage from the past that they need to let go of. Anything like that would really fall into this category. Then you have character versus nature. So this is simply a character battling any force of nature, usually to survive, to escape, or to reach civilization. I gave you the example here of 127 Hours, which was a true story about a man who had his arm trapped under a rock. And I won't spoil it for you, but he does figure out how to escape. But anytime you have a character who's like escaping the desert or a desert island or a snowy wasteland or something like that, we have character versus nature. Finally, we have character versus society. And in this conflict, your character has to overcome some kind of accepted truth or norm of society. So I gave you here Hidden Figures, a movie that came out recently about 3 black women who worked for NASA and actually kind of helped launch the space program in many ways. So they were overcoming norms of, hey, we don't let black women in, or how we don't let women in at all. So they're overcoming several different norms of society. Now, a story can have more than one of these conflicts going on at the same time. For example, Batman is obviously character versus character, but Batman is also working against his own personality and his own baggage and scars from his past. So don't feel like you can only pick one. Okay, I want to finish with some suggestions for writing your own stories that I think will really help you. First of all, you want to balance scene and exposition. So let's talk about what that means. A scene is part of a story where we are watching action unfold in real time. So this is, scene would be like when you're using dialogue and we're actually hearing people talking, or if you are describing the actions a character is taking, like if your character is picking a lock in a scene, you would say the character puts his ear up to the safe and rotates the dial until he hears a click, right? So you're going to tell us exactly what's happening step by step. Exposition is either summing up a long portion of action. So if you said something like, for years and years, John had lived in the orphanage. That would be exposition. It's not a scene because you're not showing me a day in the life of John in the orphanage. You're doing exposition because you're summing it up. Exposition can also be a character describing something, or it can be a character just thinking about something. So if a character is maybe thinking about their childhood, or making a grocery list in their head, or describing the landscape, all of those things would fall under exposition. So the key is that you need both. You need a good balance of scene and exposition in your stories. If your story is all scene, then we don't ever really get to know your characters because we don't get to hear them think, and we don't get to get inside their heads at all. We don't ever get to see them remember stuff. So you do want to have moments where we get to just hear your character thinking to themselves instead of just action, action, action. But on the other hand, if your story is all exposition, then we don't ever get to see anything happen. We don't ever get to see anybody talk to each other. We don't ever get to see your character moving around physically in space. Everything is just summed up. So you want to try to balance these things. My next tip is to start your story with something actually physically happening. If you've done a lot of essay writing in school, then you've been trained to start your pieces with an introduction, but that really kills a story. So you really don't want to start your story with a long paragraph of background information where we get the scene set for us. It's much better for you to start a story with something happening, set us in the middle of action, and then if you need to give background information, you can just work it in later or as we need it, okay? Next, let dialogue and action develop your characters. So nothing kills a story faster than a writer saying something like, John was jealous when other boys talked to Jane. Don't tell me he's jealous. Either use dialogue, so let John go have a tense conversation with one of these other guys talking to his girlfriend. Let me hear him talking, and I will figure out that he's jealous. Or use action to tell me that John is jealous. So maybe when John sees other guys talking to his girlfriend, maybe his fists clench, maybe his heart pounds, maybe he gets sweaty, something like that. Maybe he fidgets because he's nervous. But don't just tell me that he's jealous, okay? So you want, at any opportunity, you want to use dialogue or action to tell me what's going on rather than just kind of saying it plainly. Next, you want to avoid cliches and stereotypes as much as you can. So think about how many stereotypes abound about teenage girls, right? Teenage girls are only interested in boys, or all they want to do is go shopping, or they're always on their phones. Well, some of those things might be true, but you don't want to write stock characters. So if you have a teenage girl, think about how she might break the norm. If you have a set of best friends, avoid the cliches where they can read each other's minds, or where they call each other, bestie or something. Really try to break out of those molds. Finally, I want to talk about dialogue. I'm going to give you some more specific notes about writing dialogue soon, but in the meantime, the biggest problem with dialogue that I find in student writing is that it sounds too formal. And this, again, is probably because you've been trained to write essays, and we've asked you as professors to be really formal. But dialogue should sound natural. So, for example, if you have one boy calling another boy on the phone, and they're best friends, the boy won't say, "Hello, John, are you doing your homework? Is it due tomorrow?" Boys don't talk to each other that way, right? It would probably be like, "Hey, John, are you doing the homework? When's it due?" When's it due? WHEN''S, when's it due? So write dialogue the way that people might actually speak. The best way to catch this kind of thing is just to read it out loud. So think about, how casual is your character? How well do they know the person that they're talking to? Do they speak with an accent? That kind of thing. So that will give your dialogue a more natural, true feeling. As always, contact me with any questions, and I look forward to seeing your short stories soon.